The laughter of a crowded medieval fair might sound joyful to our modern ears, but if you listen closely, there's something else woven into the music, a whisper of defiance. Imagine walking through those bustling festival grounds, surrounded by bright banners and the smell of roasting meat, while just beneath your feet, hidden symbols are carved into the wooden stalls, and secret gestures pass between strangers like silent sparks of rebellion. These festivals weren't just about merriment, they were battlegrounds of tradition and resistance, where ordinary people found clever ways to challenge the powers that ruled their lives. From masked dances that mocked the nobility to feasts that doubled as covert meetings, the medieval world thrived on these hidden acts of dissent. What drove people to risk everything, their freedom, even their lives, to keep these rituals alive? Behind every seemingly innocent maypole dance or midsummer bonfire, there were layers of meaning known only to those in the know. Some ceremonies preserved ancient beliefs outlawed by the church, while others carried coded messages of political unrest. A juggler's performance might hide satire against a corrupt lord, or a seemingly random folk tune could be a map to a rebel gathering. These festivals became a rare space where the powerless could speak without fear, even if their words were disguised as entertainment. Tonight, we're stepping into that shadowy world where the line between celebration and subversion blurred. We'll uncover the lost symbols stitched into festival banners, decode the rebellious toasts shared in taverns, and trace how these acts of defiance shaped the course of history. Because the truth is, medieval festivals weren't just escapes from daily life, they were the cracks where the light of change slipped through. So grab a seat by the fire, and let's unravel the secrets that turned these gatherings into something far more dangerous and far more thrilling than they appeared. The roots of medieval festivals stretch back far beyond the Middle Ages, tangled in the ancient rhythms of the earth and the human need to mark time. Long before cathedrals rose over Europe, people gathered to celebrate the turning seasons, planting and harvest, solstice and equinox. These were moments when the veil between worlds felt thin, when spirits walked and fires burned bright to ward off the darkness. When Christianity spread across the continent, the Church faced a dilemma: stamp out these deeply ingrained traditions or reshape them. So the wild spring rites of Beltane became May Day, with its flower crowns and dances around the pole, while the riotous Saturnalia of winter slowly transformed into the more orderly celebrations of Christmas. But some things couldn't be so easily tamed. Take Carnival, that raucous season before Lent, where masks and mockery turned the social order upside down. For a few fleeting days, peasants could dress as kings, women could preach bawdy sermons, and entire villages could lampoon their lords without fear. What looked like harmless fun was often a carefully staged rebellion, a pressure valve for frustrations that might otherwise boil over. Even the Church's attempts to sanctify these festivals couldn't erase their older, wilder meanings. The bonfires of Midsummer Eve, for instance, were said to purify and protect, but their flames also recalled pagan rites honoring the sun at its zenith, a defiance of the Church's strict calendar. And then there were the quieter acts of resistance hidden in plain sight. A maypole draped in ribbons might seem innocent, but its very shape echoed older fertility symbols, a silent nod to beliefs the Church had tried to erase. The mummers' plays, with their clashing swords and resurrected heroes, kept alive fragments of pre-Christian myths under the guise of entertainment. Even the timing of these festivals spoke volumes. Many fell on dates that had once marked pagan holy days, a stubborn insistence that the old ways hadn't been forgotten. What's fascinating is how these celebrations became a kind of coded language. A shared loaf broken at a harvest feast could be a reminder of communal bonds in an age of feudal oppression. A wassail bowl passed among villagers might carry whispers of dissent beneath its honeyed ale. The festivals gave people a script to follow, a way to push back without drawing the sword. Because in a world where outright rebellion meant the gallows, sometimes the safest way to resist was to dance. Festivals became the one time each year when the strict rules of medieval society could bend or even break. Picture a harvest feast where a peasant, dressed in ragged lord's robes stolen from a scarecrow, stumbles drunkenly across the village square, his exaggerated bow so deep he topples into the mud. The crowd roars with laughter, but the joke isn't just about clumsiness. It's a razor-sharp parody of the nobility's pomp, a moment where the powerless could turn the tables through humor. Even the church, usually quick to punish disrespect, often turned a blind eye during these sanctioned outbreaks of chaos, because beneath the laughter was an unspoken truth. Letting people blow off steam for a day might keep them from storming the castle gates next week. But the pressure valve didn't always hold. In 1480, the city of Nuremberg banned masked revelers after carnival pranks escalated into real vandalism. Statues of local officials were defaced, and mocking songs about tax collectors spread like wildfire. Authorities quickly realized that costumes weren't just disguises. They were shields, giving ordinary people the courage to voice grievances they'd normally whisper behind closed doors. Women especially seized these rare moments of freedom. During the Feast of Fools, female laborers could trade their spindle for a mock scepter, ruling over rowdy processions as queens for a day. Their exaggerated edicts, like demanding men kneel to serve them ale, flipped the script on everyday life, if only briefly. Yet the most explosive festivals were those tied to old rebellions. In England, Robin Hood plays performed at summer fairs weren't just entertainment. They kept alive the memory of forest outlaws who stole from the rich to feed the poor. When villagers cheered the archers' victories over the sheriff, they weren't just applauding a character, they were celebrating a folk hero who represented their own longing for justice. Local lords knew the danger too. Some tried banning the plays outright, while others hired their own troops to perform sanitized versions where the noblemen were kindly, not cruel. But the message always slipped through. Because in a world where most couldn't read or write, festivals were the history books, the newspapers, even the protest marches of their time, all disguised as revelry. The genius of these gatherings was their double-edged nature. A lord might sponsor a feast to show generosity, but the same event could fuel resentment when villagers compared his loaded table to their own empty ones. A bishop might bless a procession, only to hear the crowd slyly alter the lyrics of hymns to mock corrupt priests. Festivals gave dissent a language that was just ambiguous enough to avoid punishment, yet crystal clear to those who needed to hear it. And that delicate balance between laughter and fury, between tradition and rebellion, is what made them so powerful. They weren't just an escape from medieval life. They were a rehearsal for changing it. Masked figures twirling through the firelight might seem like simple entertainment, but every step held hidden weight. Take the medieval Dance of the Dead, where villagers dressed as skeletons whirled through streets on the surface. It was a reminder of mortality approved by the church. Yet the way these bony figures dragged reluctant local nobles into their dance, forcing them to stumble alongside peasants, turned solemn tradition into biting satire. Even the bonfires that lit up the night carried dual meanings. When crowds leaped over flames during St. John's Eve, priests called it purification. But those same fires once honored pagan sun gods, and the act of jumping higher than your neighbors, higher than last year, whispered of older superstitions about fertility and luck. Then there were the mock trials, those raucous spectacles where drunkards or animals were put on trial for absurd crimes. In one French village, locals annually tried a rooster for the offense of crowing too early, sentencing it to a comical execution. The laughter was genuine, but so was the underlying jab at real courts where the poor faced harsh judgments while the wealthy walked free. Even children's games hid subversion. The widespread festival of the boy bishop, where a choir boy donned mock vestments to parody church rituals, started as sanctioned fun until some towns let the boy actually deliver sermons critiquing corrupt clergy. That's when bishops suddenly remembered it was just a game and shut it down. The line between tolerated mischief and rebellion was razor thin. In England, Plough Monday celebrations saw farmhands drag a plough through town demanding coins, a tradition until they started scratching up the manor's courtyard when denied. Lords who laughed along with May Day's King and Queen of Misrule grew nervous when those pretend monarchs began issuing edicts about fair wages, and when German Shrovetide players staged skits about tax collectors falling into cesspits, local officials didn't always chuckle. What made these rituals so potent was their plausible deniability. A lord couldn't arrest an entire village for dancing, even if their steps traced ancient symbols in the dirt. A priest couldn't forbid bonfires when they bore saints' names, but everyone understood the unspoken dialogue, the way a harvest effigy's straw hands clutched coins, hinting at greedy landlords, or how midsummer herbs gathered for healing were the same ones once used in pagan charms. These weren't just games, they were a language of survival, spoken in the space between what authority saw and what the people meant. The court jester with his motley coat and jingling bells might have been the only one who could mock a king to his face without losing his head, but outside castle walls, festival fools took that dangerous freedom and ran wild with it. These weren't just entertainers, they were social saboteurs, their faces hidden behind grotesque masks or smeared with soot, their voices disguised in exaggerated tones. While jesters relied on royal protection, festival fools answered to no one. They performed in town squares where butchers and bakers could cheer their jabs at corrupt officials, their parodies of greedy bishops, their skits where the devil himself outwitted a tax collector. What made these performances so explosive wasn't just the jokes, it was the costumes. A fool's ragged cloak or animal skin disguise turned him into a mythical figure, neither fully human nor entirely supernatural. In Germany, the wild man covered in moss and leaves became a festival staple, his antics blurring the line between chaos and prophecy. When he stole sausages from a merchant's stall or cursed a landlord with nonsense rhymes, the crowd roared because they recognized the truth beneath the absurdity. These characters could say what peasants couldn't, that the system was rigged, that the mighty were fools in finer clothing. Some fools belonged to clandestine groups like the French Infants Sans Souci or the German Narrenzunft, fools' guilds that were anything but silly. These societies staged elaborate plays where biblical stories twisted into political satire, their actors shielded by anonymity. In one surviving script, a donkey wearing a bishop's mitre debates theology with a drunkard playing the Pope, while the audience howls with laughter and recognition. Church officials often tried banning such performances, but the troops simply moved to another village, their messages spreading like wildfire. The real genius of these fools was their ambiguity. A joke about a greedy king could be dismissed as harmless fun, unless you noticed the fool's hat was stitched with the royal crest in tatters. A bawdy song about a monk's misdeeds might sound like simple ribaldry until you caught the lyric comparing him to a wolf among sheep. Authorities could rarely punish what they couldn't definitively prove, and that's how satire became survival. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, festival fools added plague doctors to their cast of villains, their exaggerated beak masks mocking both death and the elites who fled cities while the poor suffered. Yet the line between laughter and lynching was perilously thin. In 1520, a Swiss fool performing at a carnival was arrested mid-sketch after his impersonation of a local judge hit too close to the truth. In England, actors playing Robin Hood were sometimes whipped if their stealing from the rich bit inspired real thefts. But the fools kept adapting, their disguises growing wilder, their metaphors more coded. Because in a world where speaking truth meant death, sometimes the only safe way to scream was through a grin. A lavish banquet in the medieval world wasn't just about filling bellies, it was a loaded act of defiance. Picture a table groaning under the weight of roasted meats and steaming pies, not in some noble's hall, but in a peasant's cramped cottage. The very act of hosting such a feast flipped the script, if only for one night. Where lords usually dined on the labor of others, now farmers and craftsmen raised their own cups in toast, their laughter a quiet rebellion against the idea that only the wealthy deserved abundance. Even the menu could carry hidden meaning, a loaf shaped like a crown torn apart by bare hands, or a shared platter of humble porridge served with exaggerated ceremony, mocking the pretensions of the upper class. But the real danger lurked in the drinking songs. What sounded like rowdy tavern chants to passing guards often held razor-sharp lyrics aimed at the powerful. In England, ballads about Old King Cole twisted a legendary figure into a drunken fool who taxed his people into poverty. German villagers sang of foxes stealing geese, a not-so-subtle metaphor for landlords seizing common lands. The melodies were catchy enough to spread like wildfire, yet the verses were just ambiguous enough to give singers plausible deniability. Just a folk tune, they'd shrug, even as the local magistrate's face turned purple with rage. Authorities weren't fools, they knew the fermenting power of these gatherings. Medieval records bristle with bans on excessive drinking, not out of concern for morality, but fear. In 1381, London outlawed groups singing in alehouses after rebels used taverns to plot the Peasants' Revolt. French kings repeatedly tried to suppress grape harvest festivals, where vineyard workers, loosened by new wine, openly cursed the taxes, squeezing them dry. But bans rarely worked. A feast might be renamed a Saint's Day observance, or moved to a barn where watchmen couldn't hear the clinking cups. The brilliance of these feasts lay in their dual nature. A lord receiving an invitation to a peasant's table faced a dilemma: refuse and look arrogant, or attend and endure sly jabs disguised as toasts. Some hosts even played the gracious servant, overfilling noble guests' goblets until they slumped under the table, leaving the real conversations to happen among the lowly. And when dawn broke, the power might snap back to its usual order, but for one night the ruled became the rulers, their full plates a silent testament to what life could be if the scales ever truly tipped. The glittering masks of a Venetian carnival might seem like mere decorations today, but in the medieval world, that carved leather or painted plaster was more than a disguise, it was a weapon. When every glance from a neighbor could mean betrayal, when speaking against the wrong person might land you in a dungeon, masks offered something priceless: the freedom to be someone else, if only for a night. In Venice, where the ruling elite kept meticulous records of every citizen's movements, carnival season became the one time when a baker could whisper treason to a nobleman's ear, or a servant could mock her master to his face, all while hidden behind the blank, smiling face of a border mask. The very anonymity that made masks thrilling to authorities during peacetime made them dangerous during festivals. But Venice wasn't alone. Across Europe, masks became the uniform of rebellion. In the Swiss Alps, villagers wearing carved wooden T-shirts, masks grotesque, animalistic faces with gnashing teeth, would descend on towns during Lent, banging drums and stealing food from the wealthy. The chaos was tolerated as tradition until the year masked figures started redistributing that food to the poor. Suddenly, the joke had teeth. Similarly, in Germany's Fastnacht celebrations, masked witches and devils didn't just scare children, they collected tolls from merchants, dropping coins into the baskets of beggars watching from the crowd. The real power of these disguises lay in their collective nature. A lone masked figure could be hunted down, but when hundreds filled the streets with identical costumes, authority faltered. Records from 15th century Lyon describe a riot where masked revelers overturned tax collectors' stalls, their identities swallowed up by the sea of snarling wolf faces and horned demons. When the Duke's men demanded names, the crowd simply laughed. How could anyone identify a culprit when even their own mother wouldn't recognize them? Yet the mask's greatest rebellion was psychological. In a society where your face determined your fate, peasant, noble, outcast wearing a mask erased all of it. For those few hours, a laundress could stand shoulder to shoulder with a count, her voice carrying the same weight behind the anonymity of papier-mâché. That equality terrified the powerful. Venice eventually banned masks outside of Carnival season, while French kings outlawed full face coverings after masked mobs burned tax records in Rouen. But the genie couldn't be forced back into the bottle, because the moment people realized they could stand before power without being seen, the game changed forever. When the Church declared war on pagan traditions, it underestimated the stubbornness of memory. Those maypoles rising in village squares each spring weren't just festive decorations, they were silent declarations of defiance. To the clergy, the ribbons weaving around the poles symbolized Christian unity, but to the farmer tying those ribbons, their spiral might still echo the old ways, tracing the path of the sun or the coils of a serpent sacred to forgotten gods. Even the timing was a clue. May Day fell precisely between the spring equinox and summer solstice, a date long marked by pre-Christian cultures for fertility rites. The Church could rename the holiday, but it couldn't erase the centuries of muscle memory in the dancers' steps. Harvest festivals hid even bolder survivals. In parts of Germany, the last sheaf of grain was still shaped into a corn dolly, a practice so ancient that Roman writers recorded similar straw figures in Celtic fields. Officially, these dolls were blessings for next year's crop, yet their twisted stalks often took forms the Church couldn't explain. Horses sacred to Odin, or worse, unmistakable human shapes with exaggerated features that whispered of older harvest deities. Some villages went further, secretly burying these figures at crossroads or sinking them into rivers, rituals that mirrored pagan offerings to chthonic powers. When priests discovered such acts, they called it superstition, but the people knew this was faith wearing a disguise. The solstice fires that lit up midsummer nights carried the same double life. Church proclamations insisted these bonfires honored St. John, yet their flames still leaped highest at midnight, the witching hour when, according to folk belief, the veil between worlds frayed. Herbs tossed into those fires weren't just for fragrance, they were the same plants once used in pagan protection charms, and when young couples jumped over the embers, their laughter might cover the older incantation, "As this fire burns bright, let our love take flight." No bishop could outlaw a tradition that looked like merriment, even if its roots reached back to sun worship. What truly terrified authorities wasn't the rituals themselves, but their adaptability. When 12th century church councils banned devilish torch processions at winter solstice, the fires didn't vanish, they migrated. In the Alps, villagers began lighting candles inside hollowed turnips, their grinning faces mimicking protective spirits. In England, the Yule log acquired a Christian veneer, yet families still kept its charred remnants to ward off lightning, just as their ancestors had done for Thor. The faith might change names, but the fire's power remained. The most striking survival wasn't in grand gestures, but in whispered details. A baker might shape his loaf with 5 incisions seemingly random, until you noticed they matched the pentagram once carved onto Celtic hearthbreads. A midwife could be seen accidentally spilling salt during a christening feast, precisely where old Nordic traditions placed it for protection. These weren't clumsy mistakes, but quiet acts of remembrance. Because in a world where outright pagan worship meant death, the rebellion had gone subterranean, hiding in the fold of a skirt, the turn of a phrase, the unbroken circle of a festival dance that, no matter what the priest said, would always end where it began. The line between festival laughter and revolutionary fury could vanish in an instant. Take the English peasants' revolt of 1381. What began as grievances whispered during May Day alehouse gatherings exploded into full-blown rebellion when radical priest John Ball stood atop a hill in Kent, rallying villagers with a sermon ripped straight from festival plays, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. His words, echoing the egalitarian themes of Midsummer Mama's performances, ignited a fire that couldn't be quenched. Within weeks, thousands marched on London, their banners bearing not saints or coats of arms, but the grinning faces of festival fools, a deliberate mockery of the authority they aimed to topple. Festival networks became the underground railroads of dissent. Traveling performers who once staged Robin Hood skits now carried coded messages between villages, using the cover of their costumes to slip past watchmen. In Germany, Shrovetide parades featuring the procession of the 12 drunkards suddenly saw those drunken caricatures replaced with effigies of local tax collectors, effigies that crowds gleefully burned. Authorities initially dismissed these acts as rowdy humor until they realized the same wagons used to haul festival props were transporting weapons beneath layers of straw and ribbons. The church's own holiday sometimes backfired spectacularly. During Whitsuntide celebrations in Flanders, when villagers traditionally reenacted biblical scenes, they began staging the Massacre of the Innocents, with local landlords playing Herod's soldiers. What started as pious theater turned violent when real grievances boiled over in 1429, with revelers swapping wooden props for farming tools and sacking tax offices. The pattern repeated across Europe. A harvest feast in Catalonia devolved into grain store raids, while a bohemian midsummer bonfire became the rallying point for Hussite rebels. When rulers finally grasped the danger, their crackdowns exposed their deepest fears. England banned all outdoor assemblies after the Peasants' Revolt, even maypole dances, while Florence outlawed masked gatherings for decades following the Ciompi wool workers' uprising. But the most telling response came from Paris in 1580, where authorities didn't just cancel Carnival. They staged a gruesome counter-spectacle, hanging suspected rebel leaders in clown costumes at the city gates. The message was clear. What they dismissed as peasant foolishness had always been power's greatest threat the moment when play stopped pretending. Yet the rebellions left an indelible mark. Though crushed, the revolts forced concessions, lowered taxes in some regions, restored common lands in others. More crucially, they proved festivals weren't just safety valves for discontent, but dress rehearsals for revolution. Every time villagers practiced equality in the dance circle or shared looted meat at a mock king's feast, they remembered, if only for a night, what justice tasted like. And that memory, once kindled, proved far harder to extinguish than any bonfire. The church's relationship with medieval festivals was a tightrope walk between control and chaos. On one hand, bishops understood the power of celebration, how a well-timed feast for a patron saint could bind communities to the church's calendar. But those same gatherings carried a dangerous undercurrent, a reminder that faith could be as wild as it was orderly. Take the Feast of Fools, where lower clergy, the subdeacons and choir boys, were allowed to briefly seize control, wearing masks backward, braying like donkeys during Mass, even electing a boy bishop to parody their superiors. Church councils alternately condemned the tradition as sacrilege and tolerated it as a harmless release valve, because beneath the raucous surface lay an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the best way to keep people loyal was to let them laugh at the very institution demanding their obedience. Not all priests played along. In 1320, the Archbishop of Cologne raged against Shrove-tide revelers who dressed as monks and staged mock baptisms using beer instead of holy water. Yet for every outraged cleric, there seemed to be another secretly joining the fray. Records from Burgundy describe a parish priest who led his flock in a midwinter procession not with hymns, but with a bull's skull mounted on a pole, its horns wrapped in ribbons that matched descriptions of ancient pagan totems. When questioned, he claimed it was simply an old country custom, shrugging off accusations of heresy. This duality ran deep. The same church that burned witches also preserved fragments of folk magic in its blessings. The same institution that banned maypole dances quietly absorbed their symbols into new Saints' Day processions. The tension peaked around Carnival, that raucous pre-Lent explosion of excess. Italian bishops penned endless decrees against masked debauchery, even as their own nephews danced in piazzas wearing devil horns. In 1512, a Venetian cardinal famously tried to cancel Carnival altogether, only to find his own clergy sneaking out to join the revels, because for all the church's power, it couldn't stamp out humanity's need for temporary anarchy. Even the sacraments themselves weren't immune to parody. In France, drinkers' masses became a carnival staple, where wine replaced communion wine, sausages stood in for the host, and the congregation confessed gluttony instead of sin. What made these acts so threatening wasn't just their irreverence, but their ambiguity. A priest leading a blessing over fields might secretly be performing the same gestures his grandfather used for the old harvest gods. A nun teaching children to weave flower crowns for Corpus Christi could be passing down patterns once meant for Fraser's devotees. The church's genius and its frustration lay in its inability to fully erase what came before. Every time it stamped out one pagan survival, two more sprouted in its place, disguised as harmless fun or local tradition. Because in the end, the people's faith was like festival fire. It could be banked, redirected, even blessed by a priest, but never fully extinguished. For a few precious days each year, the rigid rules of medieval courtship didn't just bend, they shattered. Imagine a Midsummer's Eve where women, normally barred from speaking first to suitors, could openly propose marriage with a garland of flowers. In German Fastnacht celebrations, young men donned dresses and wigs to play the foolish virgin, their exaggerated curtsies mocking both gender norms and the church's obsession with chastity. Even the most conservative villages tolerated these reversals, treating them as harmless fun, but beneath the laughter lay a radical idea. What if life didn't have to follow the same script forever? The most daring rebellions unfolded in the shadows of these sanctioned chaos. Scottish Beltane fires saw couples leap over flames together, a ritual that doubled as cover for eloping lovers. In France, charivari processions officially meant to shame mismatched spouses often became impromptu weddings for pairs denied by family feuds or class divides. A surviving account from 1423 describes a butcher's daughter and a squire exchanging vows during a May Day parade. There witnesses a dozen masked revelers who conveniently forgot their identities when questioned by the squire's furious father. Cross-dressing offered another tantalizing taste of freedom. When English mummers' plays featured women playing knights or boys prancing as milkmaids, it wasn't just comedy. It exposed the absurdity of treating clothing as sacred. Records from Nuremberg's Carnival reveal seamstresses charging double to stitch men's hose for women who wanted to dance in taverns without harassment. The church fretted over these blurred lines, passing decrees against unseemly apparel. But even priests struggled to enforce modesty when their own choir boys dressed as angels in flowing gowns for epiphany pageants. The true subversion lay in how these fleeting moments lingered. A peasant girl who led the May Day procession as the Queen of Love might return home with her head just a little higher, her voice steadier when bargaining with the miller. A young man who spent carnival night dancing in his sister's kirtle could never quite see her or himself the same way again. Festivals didn't just break rules, they planted seeds, showing that the world's walls were thinner than they seemed. And though Monday morning always came with its familiar chains, something restless now stirred beneath the surface, waiting for next year's fires to fan it back to life. The laughter and masks of Carnival might paint a picture of harmless revelry, but peel back the gilded veneer, and you'll find something far darker simmering beneath. For all its colorful processions and raucous songs, this was the one time of year when the unspoken rules of medieval society didn't just bend, they snapped. Records from cities like Basel and Cologne tell of streets running red with wine and blood alike, as drunken brawls spilled from taverns into squares. Watchmen knew better than to intervene when gangs of butchers and tanners, their faces hidden behind grotesque wooden masks, turned rivalries into full-blown battles under cover of celebration. Even theft took on a carnivalesque flair. In 15th century Venice, pickpockets worked in teams, one distracting victims with bawdy jokes while another slit their purses. A sleight of hand applauded by onlookers as just another part of the show. What made this violence so potent was its ambiguity. A merchant stall overturned in the chaos might look like accidental revelry, unless you noticed the same stall belonged to a man notorious for shortchanging customers. In Nuremberg, archives describe apple raids where youths pelted unpopular officials with rotten fruit, their attacks disguised as playful tradition. Authorities walked a razor's edge, cracking down too harshly risked igniting real rebellion, yet doing nothing invited anarchy. Some towns tried compromise, like the Fool's License, issued in Strasbourg, a parchment that granted wearers permission to mock authority figures, but only between noon and 3 o'clock on Shrove Tuesday. The message was clear: dissent had its place and its limits, but the most explosive acts were calculated. In 1484, the Milanese Carnival turned deadly when masked revelers burned effigies of the ruling Sforza family alongside biblical villains like Herod. By morning, those same effigies had been replaced with the likenesses of tax collectors, their straw bodies torn apart by the crowd. Elsewhere, the line between symbolic and literal rebellion blurred entirely. French peasants used carnival floats to smuggle weapons into walled cities, hiding swords beneath mounds of festive greenery. In Ghent, a mock trial condemning a straw-stuffed duke for greed escalated into a real storming of the grain warehouses when someone shouted that the real duke's stores were just as full. The church's response revealed their deepest fears. While they tolerated the feast of fools' clerical parodies, they drew the line at Carnival's more visceral threats. In 1491, the Bishop of Autun banned all masked gatherings after revelers staged a Black Mass procession featuring a donkey dressed in vestments, a joke that turned sinister when the animal was found hanged the next morning. Secular rulers were equally wary. Venice's Council of 10 kept exhaustive lists of banned carnival masks, from those resembling Ottoman sultans to designs mocking the Doge's crown. Because in a world where identity was power, anonymity became the ultimate weapon. Yet for all the chaos, Carnival's darkest legacy wasn't the broken bones or stolen goods. It was the proof that order itself was fragile. When the masks came off and the ashes cooled, everyone remembered, if just for a moment, how easily the world could be turned upside down. And that memory, more than any drunken brawl or trampled banner, was what truly terrified those in charge. Beneath the raucous surface of medieval festivals, secret threads connected certain celebrations to something far more structured, shadowy networks that used merriment as a cloak for power. The Charivari, that rowdy procession of masked figures banging pots and pans, seemed like simple mischief to outsiders. But in French villages, these noisy parades often targeted specific victims: a wife beater, a cheating spouse, or a landlord who raised rents with chilling precision. The masks granted anonymity, yes, but the coordination revealed something deeper: a communal court where the powerless could deliver verdicts without judges. Some Charivaris even kept written lists of grievances passed between households, their mockery as carefully planned as any legal proceeding. Other groups operated with even greater secrecy. In the Alpine regions, the Pachtenlov, a winter procession of horned and fanged creatures wasn't just folklore. Those wearing the terrifying wooden masks belonged to tight-knit brotherhoods. Their membership whispered to include charcoal burners and miners who worked in darkness year-round. Initiates underwent rituals mimicking death and rebirth, their bodies purified by smoke and chanting before they earned the right to don the sacred horns. To villagers, these figures warded off evil spirits. To the brotherhoods, the performances preserved older beliefs about the underworld, their dances mapping secret paths through the forest that doubled as escape routes during crackdowns. Then there were the Calusari of Eastern Europe, dancers who spun in hypnotic circles to flute music during summer festivals. Officially, they healed the possessed with their whirling steps. But their intricate footwork hid coded messages patterns that traced the boundaries of forbidden pagan shrines or marked safe houses for persecuted heretics. Some initiates even sewed tiny metal charms into their sashes, each jingling bell tuned to a note that, when combined with others, played melodies used to identify allies. The church dismissed them as superstitious performers, yet archives from Transylvania note how Calusari leaders mysteriously vanished whenever inquisitors came asking questions. The most politically potent societies often hid in plain sight. London's midsummer watch parades featured guildsmen carrying elaborate lanterns shaped like dragons and unicorns, a spectacle that delighted crowds. But the wax beasts also served as signals. The candlemaker's dragon might tilt its head toward a corrupt official's house, while the weaver's unicorn pointed where rebel pamphlets were hidden. In one notorious incident in 1523, a baker's guild used their festival float, a giant oven spewing flames of painted cloth, to block the mayor's guards while apprentices looted a grain hoarder's warehouse. By the time authorities realized the distraction, the float's hollow base had already carried the stolen sacks away. What united these groups wasn't just secrecy, but a shared language of symbols. A maypole's ribbons might knot in patterns denoting meeting times. A wassail bowl passed left instead of right could warn of spies in the room. Even the fool's bells weren't random in Swiss Carnival records. Certain jingling sequences matched the cadence of underground protest songs. Authorities who dismissed these details as peasant nonsense learned too late that festivity could be the perfect disguise for dissent. Because when everyone expects revelry, no one notices the revolution brewing behind the laughter. A fox slinking through the festival crowd wasn't just a clever costume, it was a flashing signal to those who knew how to look. In medieval Europe, every animal mask carried a hidden lexicon, a language of rebellion stitched into fur and feathers. The fox, with its sly grin and bushy tail, didn't just represent cunning. It mocked the church's preachers who accused peasants of being too clever for their own good. A reveller wearing its likeness might steal sausages from a merchant's stall in exaggerated pantomime, but the real theft was the way he exposed hypocrisy, showing how the powerful were the true tricksters. Wolves, though, spoke a darker tongue. When packs of wolves prowled winter festivals in the Alps, their snarling masks and tattered pelts weren't just for show. They embodied the outlaws who haunted the forest's men driven to banditry by hunger, their existence a direct challenge to lords who fenced off common hunting grounds. In one notorious French village, the annual Wolf King procession saw a masked figure devour a lamb made of bread, only to spit out coins for the poor. The local bishop condemned it as sacrilege, but the message was clear. Sometimes the monster was the only one feeding the hungry. Goats, though, carried the most explosive baggage. With their leaping dances and suggestive horns, they channeled Pan and the satyr's creatures the church had demonized as lustful devils. But in festival skits, the goat wasn't just a symbol of sin, it became a weapon. In Bavaria, plays featured goats outwitting pompous priests, their ribald jokes turning the clergy's own sermons against them. The animal's fertility symbolism also couldn't be erased. No matter how often priests preached chastity, May Day still saw young couples leaving wreaths at shrines where goat-headed carvings peeked from the weeds. The true genius of these disguises lay in their deniability. A lord watching a fox steal from his steward might chuckle until he noticed the animal's sash matched his own coat of arms. A bishop enjoying a goat dance could applaud, only to realize too late that the horns were shaped like a mitre, and when authorities banned certain animals, the people adapted. In Sweden, where wolf masks were outlawed after a rebellion, revelers switched to bears, another creature of untamed wilderness, just with a different growl. These performances weren't just satire, they were survival. When a goat led a procession to the manor gates, demanding ale in a squeaky voice, everyone heard the unspoken demand behind the farce: "We feed you. Now feed us." And when the laughter died down, the masks hanging on cottage walls remained silent reminders that the animals and the truths they carried could never be fully caged. A minstrel strumming his lute in a crowded tavern might seem harmless until you catch the lyrics slipping between the notes. Medieval music wasn't just for dancing. It was a razor wrapped in silk, its melodies carrying messages too dangerous to speak aloud. Take the infamous Song of the Husbandman, a ballad that spread like wildfire across 14th century England. On the surface, it told the woes of a struggling farmer. But between its rollicking verses, listeners heard the real target: a king whose taxes left children hungry. When authorities finally banned the song, villagers simply changed the words, disguising it as a harmless harvest chant. The melody became a weapon, passed mouth to mouth like a whispered secret. Some musicians took even bolder risks. In France, the jongleurs, wandering performers with no fixed loyalty, crafted songs that mocked bishops for their lavish feasts while peasants starved. Their lyrics were so biting that King Philip IV ordered their tongues cut out for slanderous verses. Yet the songs lived on, adapted by street children who sang them in squeaky voices, turning the king's cruelty into another punchline. The church fought back with censorship, listing banned melodies in decrees, but music proved harder to control than parchment. A tune hummed while hoeing a field or churned butter could spread farther than any sermon. The most ingenious dissidents wove codes into their compositions. In Flanders, rebel weavers used the rhythmic clatter of their looms to send messages, a specific pattern signaling when tax collectors were near. A surviving diary from Bruges describes how a ditty about the miller's wayward daughter actually mapped escape routes for fugitives, its chorus counting the turns to a safe house. Even nursery rhymes held double meanings. "London Bridge is falling down" may sound childish, but some historians argue its origins lie in 11th century protests against tolls, the fair lady of the lyrics standing for the city itself, besieged by greedy lords. What made music so threatening was its ability to bypass reason and strike straight at the heart. A cleric might dismiss a peasant's complaint as ignorance, but when 100 voices rose in a hymn comparing him to Judas, the insult stuck. Noblemen who laughed at a jester's parody of their accents grew uneasy when the same tune was whistled by their stable hands. And when the Black Death emptied villages, survivors turned their grief into dirges that accused both heaven and crown. These weren't just songs, they were trials by melody, with every chorus delivering another verdict. Yet for all the danger, musicians kept playing, because in a world where words could get you hanged, a lute string might just say what a tongue dared not. The clinking of coins under festival tents wasn't just the sound of commerce, it was the heartbeat of quiet economic warfare. While lords and bishops fretted over pagan rituals, they often missed the more dangerous rebellion happening in plain sight. Peasants using these gatherings to dismantle the feudal economy piece by piece. Take the hiring fairs that sprouted like mushrooms after May Day celebrations. For most of the year, serfs were bound to their land, but during festivals, a laborer could suddenly demand double wages to work the harvest, knowing his lord couldn't afford to refuse with ripe grain waiting in the fields. Records from Suffolk show farmers whispering to each other behind gloved hands, comparing offers like medieval free agents while their masters fumed. Black markets flourished under the colorful chaos. A peddler selling ribbons might discreetly trade salt from untaxed mines, his stall's bright fabrics hiding contraband beneath. In alpine regions, entire cheese races were staged where runners carried wheels down mountain paths, conveniently passing unguarded borders where no tolls were paid. Even the church's own fairs weren't immune. At the great champagne markets, wine merchants used the noise of troubadours to cover the scrape of altered scales, while fish sellers smuggled barrels of herring past tax collectors by labeling them as festival decorations. The most brazen acts happened during mock auctions. At German Kirmes celebrations, villagers would sell each other's livestock in exaggerated bidding wars, only to return the animals afterward, a not-so-subtle lesson in collective bargaining. In one notorious case from 1489, a group of Swiss dairy farmers staged an entire fake market where they purchased their own cows back from a fictional lord, demonstrating how easily property rights could be overturned when people worked together. Tax evasion became an art form. When French kings imposed the hated gay belle salt tax, coastal villages began holding sandcastle competitions during festivals, perfect cover for unloading untaxed salt from beached boats under cover of darkness. English weavers wove secret pockets into Carnival banners to hide wool from royal inspectors, while Spanish vintners baptized their barrels with fake festival names to dodge duties. Authorities knew these tricks but found themselves powerless. Cracking down on a harvest feast risked igniting full-scale revolt. Perhaps the most ingenious economic sabotage happened at the banquet table. Peasants who normally ate coarse bread would suddenly produce white flour for festival cakes, flour milled from grain lost during the Lord's tithe collection. A roasted goose served at a serf's midsummer feast wasn't just a meal. It was a declaration that commoners too could taste abundance, if only for one defiant night. These weren't just parties, they were rehearsals for a world where wealth wasn't hoarded by the few, but shared by the many, one stolen bite at a time. When the Waldensians slipped into a village festival, they didn't carry Bibles or preach fire and brimstone sermons. They came disguised as traveling players. To the crowd gathered in the square, it was just another morality play about a greedy merchant or a kind shepherd. but woven between the lines of dialogue were radical ideas, scripture translated into common tongues, critiques of church wealth, even quiet endorsements of women teaching spiritual truths. These weren't mere entertainers, they were missionaries using laughter as a Trojan horse. A surviving account from 14th century Lyon describes a troupe performing The Miser and the Beggar, where the titular miser wore robes suspiciously resembling the local bishop's vestments, while the beggar quoted scripture verbatim, a heresy punishable by burning if done openly. Yet who could prove the actors weren't just jesting? The Lollards perfected this dangerous game. Under cover of midsummer bonfires, their followers would sing ballads about simple priests of old who lived in poverty, a sharp contrast to the gem-encrusted clergy watching from the sideline. In England, authorities grew paranoid about puppet shows featuring Saint Wilfrid, whose wooden mouth miraculously recited Bible passages in English instead of Latin. One frustrated inquisitor's journal from 1420 laments finding an entire Waldensian catechism hidden inside a festival wagon's false bottom, its pages cleverly disguised as play scripts with stage directions like "crowd cheers here," marking key theological points. Church officials weren't fools. They knew heresy thrived in the liminal space between sacred and profane. Dominican inquisitors trained to spot coded messages in maypole ribbons. Certain knot patterns allegedly signaled safe houses for heretics. In Austria, a bishop banned all performances featuring the Good Cobbler after realizing the shoemaker's humble trade mirrored Waldensian ideals of manual labor as divine calling. But the crackdowns often backfired. When Parisian authorities arrested mummers for staging a play about the emperor's new robes, where the naked ruler bore a striking resemblance to the Pope, the ensuing riots forced their release. The most explosive collisions happened during Corpus Christi processions. While the faithful carried Eucharistic banners, heretics sometimes staged competing tableaux, like the notorious 1486 incident in Toulouse where a float depicted the Last Supper with 12 female disciples. Witnesses described the local inquisitor's face turning whiter than the host as the wagon rolled past. Yet proving heresy required navigating a maze of plausible deniability. Was that Lollard really teaching scripture or just reciting lines? Did the Waldensian actor criticize clerical greed, or was he simply playing his role too well? What truly terrified the church wasn't the content, but the medium. A peasant who'd never sit through a sermon would gladly memorize every word of a catchy festival tune mocking fat priests. A lord who burned heretical texts couldn't unhear the jokes his stable boys now sang while grooming horses. And when the same melodies later carried revolutionary lyrics during the Hussite Wars, the connection became undeniable. Festivals didn't just spread heresy. They made it unforgettable. The mock battles of medieval festivals started as theater until the first real punch landed. What began as choreographed clashes between knights in painted armor or rival guilds waving wooden swords could erupt into genuine brawls with startling speed. In 15th century Provence, the annual Battle of the Bridge saw teams from opposite banks of a river compete to capture a banner, their wooden staves supposedly padded with straw. But town records tell a different story. Broken noses, shattered ribs, even one drowning when a furious contestant held his rival underwater too long. Authorities shrugged it off as festive excess, but the undercurrent was clear. This was more than just play. Blood sports pushed the boundaries even further. Bear baiting and bull running were officially sanctioned entertainments, yet they carried a whiff of rebellion. When a maddened bull broke loose during a Suffolk fair in 1421, rampaging through the market stalls of wealthy merchants before peasants lured it away with stolen apples, the cheers sounded suspiciously like approval. Cockfighting pits became unlikely arenas of class warfare, with laborers betting their meager wages against the fat purses of local officials, and sometimes winning. In Germany, the finger-häkeln finger-pulling contests turned into brutal tests of endurance, where village champions vied to yank their opponent across a table, their raw, bleeding fingers becoming symbols of stubborn defiance. The chaos wasn't accidental, it was catharsis. For serfs who spent their lives bowing to lords, these violent games offered a rare chance to hit back, if only by proxy. A surviving diary from Burgundy describes a Shrovetide soccer match where the ball was replaced with a bloated pig's bladder, the teams divided between lords and peasants. By the end, the peasant side had not only won but ritually dismembered the bladder, stuffing pieces into the boots of fleeing noble spectators. The church condemned such savagery, yet even priests recognized its purpose. As one abbot grudgingly wrote, "Better they bloodden each other one day than revolt the next." Some traditions teetered on the knife's edge of outright rebellion. In Italy's Battaglia dell'Arons, orange-throwing battles between neighborhoods began as fertility rites, but morphed into targeted attacks on tax collectors' houses. Swiss Revelli parades, where children carried lanterns carved from turnips, took a sinister turn when adults began hollowing out larger roots to hurl like projectiles at bailiffs' windows. And in the Scottish Highlands, the seemingly innocent tug of war over a pit of mud masked older rituals of territorial dispute, with the losing village obligated to forfeit a portion of that year's harvest. What made these violent customs so potent was their dual nature. A lord watching his peasants pummel each other in a boxing match might chuckle at their rustic vigor until he noticed the fighters' wraps were stitched with symbols mocking his coat of arms. A bishop could bless a wrestling tournament as wholesome sport, unaware that the victor's prize, a golden belt, would later be melted down to forge arrowheads. Because in the end, these weren't just games. They were pressure valves, rehearsals, and sometimes the first sparks of something far more dangerous. When the blood dried and the crowds dispersed, the message lingered. Beneath the pageantry, the medieval world was always one festival away from boiling over. A drunken monk stumbles across the stage, his robes stained with wine, his pockets bulging with fake gold. The crowd erupts with laughter, but the bishop in attendance isn't smiling. This scene from a 15th century French festival play wasn't just entertainment. It was a calculated act of defiance disguised as comedy. Across medieval Europe, satire became the people's sharpest weapon, its barbs hidden beneath the velvet of performance. In England, traveling troupes staged The Vice and the Virtue, where corrupt judges were portrayed with exaggerated red noses and pockets sewn upside down to accidentally spill bribes. German Shrovetide plays featured tax collectors tripping over their own ledgers, while Italian Carnival floats rolled through town with effigies of local officials perched atop donkeys, their papier-mâché faces twisted into grotesque caricatures. What made these performances so dangerous was their plausible deniability. A lord couldn't arrest an actor for playing a fool unless he admitted the fool resembled him. Records from Nuremberg reveal how one mayor tried to prosecute players for slanderous impersonation, only to have the troupe produce an identical script performed in another town with different character names. The real punchline: both versions were based on the same corrupt official. Even the church struggled to counter satire's viral spread. When Dominican preachers in Lyon condemned a play mocking clerical gluttony, the actors simply rewrote it as The Gluttonous Miller, keeping every joke intact but changing the costumes. Yet some rulers recognized satire's double edge. The same English kings who banned Robin Hood plays hired court jesters to roast their advisors with impunity. Frederick III of Germany kept a stable of satirists to lampoon his rivals, while the Medici family secretly funded carnival floats mocking their political enemies. This uneasy dance between repression and co-option revealed a truth that terrified the powerful. Laughter couldn't be controlled. When authorities in Ghent executed a puppeteer for staging The Greedy Bailiff in 1492, 3 identical puppet shows appeared the next week, each claiming to be an entirely original work. The most subversive acts thrived in ambiguity. A Swiss New Year's play featured a character called Herr Everyman, who stole from the rich to feed the poor. Was it biblical allegory or socialist manifesto? The debate itself was the satire. In Spain, actors performed The Mayor's New Clothes, with the lead role alternating nightly between different performers, ensuring no single person could be blamed when the script quoted real corruption scandals verbatim. Even children's games got in on the act. German carnival traditions included Pin the Tail on the Taxman, where blindfolded kids stuck donkey tails to a portrait of the local official. By the late Middle Ages, satire had become so ingrained in festival culture that attempts to suppress it only amplified its power. When the Duke of Burgundy band plays mocking nobility, bakers started selling gingerbread men with crowns askew edible dissent that disappeared down throats before guards could confiscate them. The church's own morality plays backfired spectacularly when audiences cheered for the sinful characters who at least enjoyed life, while the pious protagonists were mocked as hypocrites. In the end, the joke was on those who thought they could silence ridicule, because when every peasant could spot a tyrant beneath a jester's hat, no amount of censorship could unmake that truth. The stage might be temporary, but the lesson lingered long after the costumes were put away. A sprig of rosemary tucked into a festival wreath might look like simple decoration unless you knew the girl who placed it there whispered her lover's name 3 times as she wove it. Beneath the music and merriment of medieval festivals ran an undercurrent of folk magic, where every herb, gesture, and whispered incantation held power. Young women scoured midsummer fields at dawn for dew-soaked flowers, believing washing their faces in it would reveal their future husband's face. Apple peels tossed over shoulders curled into the initials of soulmates, while hazelnuts roasted in bonfire embers. If 2 burned side by side without cracking, it meant enduring love. These weren't just games, they were acts of defiance against a world where marriages were often transactions and fate was controlled by the powerful. But love spells were just the beginning. Fortune-telling flourished in the liminal space of festivals where normal rules seemed suspended. In Bohemia, girls floated candlelit walnut shells in bowls of water. The direction they drifted predicted where a suitor would come from. German farmers buried eggs marked with symbols under festival bonfires, digging them up at dawn to read the coming year's harvest. Even the church's own feast days couldn't escape these practices. At Candlemas, peasants smuggled half-burned candles home from Mass, lighting them during storms to ward off lightning, a folk charm thinly disguised as piety. The most daring rituals blurred into outright witchcraft. Scottish Beltane revelers leaped over flames not just for luck, but to purify themselves of elf shot, invisible arrows thought to cause illness. In France, women danced backward around crossroads at midnight during St. John's Eve, gathering soil said to curse unfaithful husbands. Some acts were so secret they left no records, just whispers in trial transcripts about certain ungodly rites performed under pretense of maying. When a Swiss herbalist was burned in 1420 for selling festival love potions, authorities discovered her recipes contained no exotic ingredients, just common flowers arranged in patterns matching ancient pagan sigils. What terrified authorities wasn't the magic itself, but what it represented, a refusal to accept the world as it was. A serf might never overthrow his lord, but he could carve protective runes into a festival loaf to guard his family from harm. A milkmaid betrothed to a cruel older man couldn't break the contract, but she could slip a honey-drenched thistle into the bonfire, murmuring rhymes to sweeten a sour match. These were small rebellions, yes, but in a world where the church claimed a monopoly on miracles and kings dictated destiny, even the smallest act of self-determination was revolutionary. The line between tradition and heresy was perilously thin. A Welsh village blessing of the apples might involve chanting over fruit in a sacred grove, harmless folk custom unless the chants were in a language older than Latin. German festival bread shaped like sunwheels could be dismissed as whimsy unless someone noticed they matched pre-Christian artifacts dug up nearby. Authorities often turned a blind eye, but when tensions flared, these practices became deadly evidence. The same village midwife praised for her healing festival teas in summer might be accused of witchcraft by winter if harvests failed or a nobleman's child fell ill. Yet the rituals persisted, passed down in gestures too subtle to prosecute. A mother teaching her daughter to twist dandelion stems into festival garlands for luck might secretly be showing her how to recognize the ones that induced sleep. A blacksmith's apprentice hammering tin charms into carnival masks could be learning which metals accidentally resembled protective symbols, because in the end, these weren't just superstitions, they were maps to survival, written in the language of petals and smoke and midnight dances. And long after the fires burned low, that knowledge still smoldered in the hearts of those who refused to let their fates be decided by crown or cross alone. A roasted peacock served at a peasant's wedding wasn't just a meal, it was a flaming act of treason. Medieval sumptuary laws meticulously dictated who could eat what, with punishments for commoners caught savoring meats like swan or venison reserved for nobility. Yet festival tables groaned under forbidden delicacies anyway, spiced sausages smuggled from town guilds, pastries shaped like crowns and devoured with exaggerated relish, even the occasional haunch of poached deer served with a wink. The message was clear: for one night, the rules didn't apply. In Bavaria, records tell of a butcher fined for serving veal at a harvest feast, only for the entire village to donate coins for his fine while defiantly roasting another calf the following week. Some dishes carried covert signals. The German Fastnachtsküchel, fried dough dusted with sugar, often hid charms baked inside: a tiny knife for resistance, a bean for fertility, or in one notorious case from Strasbourg, a scrap of parchment listing local tax collectors' names. Venetian carnival cakes called frittole sometimes concealed silver pins beneath their raisins, a tradition authorities tried to ban after revelers wore them as badges of solidarity during a dockworkers' strike. Even the humble pretzel, twisted into its distinctive shape as a secret symbol, some claim its loops represented arms crossed in prayer, but guild records from Austria suggest bakers used them to mark houses sympathetic to peasant uprisings. The rebellion extended to how food was served. Elaborate pies might burst open to release live birds, mocking the empty grandeur of noble banquets, while stone soup made by beggars at festivals became a pointed lesson in communal sharing versus aristocratic hoarding. In England, the Lord of Misrule at winter feasts often demanded his meat be served on overturned shields or dented helmets, a not-so-subtle jab at the knightly class. One Yorkshire account describes villagers force-feeding a particularly cruel landlord's steward a humble pie, literally filled with crow meat and bitter herbs, while singing a ballad about justice. Drinking rituals turned equally subversive. Wassail bowls passed hand to hand at midwinter festivals required each participant to lock eyes with the next as they drank, creating chains of unspoken trust. In Bohemia, toasts were made with vessels marked with hidden etchings, a crown under the rim to signify royal oppression, or a hanged man on the base for resistance. Authorities grew so wary of these coded cups that some towns mandated plain glassware for public gatherings, only for brewers to start staining their ales deep enough to obscure messages scratched into tankard bottoms. Perhaps the most ingenious act of culinary defiance was the illusion of scarcity. Peasants who normally stretched meager rations would suddenly produce lavish spreads at festivals, their sudden abundance a silent accusation against landlords who claimed poverty while raising rents. A single cheese wheel shared among 50 people became a shared triumph, while a slaughtered pig roasted whole for a Saint's Day feast stood as proof that the poor could taste plenty when systems of control loosened. These meals weren't just nourishment, they were edible manifestos, their flavors lingering long after the bones were buried and the crumbs swept away. Because in a world where bread could mean the difference between life and death, breaking it together became the ultimate act of rebellion. The crackdown came slowly at first, a banned masque here, a rewritten play there, but by the 16th century, Europe's rulers had grown wise to the power of festival rebellion. As kings consolidated power and standing armies replaced feudal levies, the once tolerated chaos of Carnival began to look less like harmless fun and more like a threat. In England, Henry VIII's officials replaced raucous May Day games with sanitized royal progresses, where the monarch's agent stage managed every cheer. German princes hired court artists to redesign Shrovetide parades, swapping grotesque peasant masks for classical allegories praising the regime. Even Venice's infamous Carnival, that bastion of anonymity, saw its masks registered and its satires pre-approved by nervous doges. The message was clear: your laughter would be permitted, but only on our terms. Yet the old spirit proved harder to extinguish than authorities anticipated. When French kings tried replacing the rowdy charivari with orderly military parades, villagers simply moved their noisy processions to midnight, banging pots under the windows of unpopular officials. In Sweden, maypoles officially became festive decorations, but country folk still danced sunwise circles around them, their footsteps tracing patterns older than Christianity. The most ingenious adaptations happened in plain sight, like the German Kinderfest tradition, where children carried harmless-looking lanterns in daytime processions, only for adults to repurpose the same lanterns after dark as signals for clandestine meetings. The church's reforms met similar resistance. When bishops ordered passion plays to focus solely on scripture, performers added sly asides. A villainous Pharisee might suddenly speak with the local tax collector's accent, or Pontius Pilate's robe might bear a suspicious resemblance to the Pope's vestments. Spanish villagers told to reenact saintly miracles instead staged miracles where bread multiplied to feed the hungry, a not-so-subtle critique of grain hoarders. Even the new, approved festivals carried hidden barbs. A Bohemian town's official tribute to their Habsburg rulers featured a mechanical eagle that accidentally dropped fake dung on the governor's seat every performance. What truly changed wasn't the people's desire to rebel, but the risks of doing so openly. As centralized courts extended their reach, punishment became swifter and more brutal. A Swiss farmer who once might have gotten away with singing a mocking ballad now faced the rack if his lyrics mentioned the Duke by name. English wool workers who traditionally used midsummer bonfires to burn effigies of greedy merchants found themselves transported to colonies if caught. The stakes rose highest in border regions when Scottish Highlanders continued their riotous Beltane fires after the union with England. Redcoats began documenting participants for subsequent arrests. Yet in the cracks between sanctioned celebrations, fragments of defiance survived. A Welsh harvest festival might feature a sanctioned bardic competition with the winning poem's metaphors clearly praising last year's food rioters. Dutch ice skating races on St. Nicholas Day became cover for distributing pamphlets against Spanish rule. Even the genteel masquerade balls of the 18th century hid dangers. Aristocrats learned too late that their own servants were listening behind Venetian masks, memorizing careless words about taxes or war to spread in the streets. The greatest irony, the very efforts to sanitize festivals often backfired. When authorities replaced the wild Feast of Fools with orderly nativity pageants, they accidentally preserved older traditions. The Herod character in Christmas plays retained the exaggerated bluster of Carnival kings, while the shepherds kept the earthy humor of peasant satires. What rulers dismissed as tamed entertainment remained in the people's hearts, a continuation of the old resistance by other means, because no amount of pageantry could erase the memory of those fleeting nights when the world turned upside down, and the powerless, just for a moment, held the reins. The echoes of medieval defiance still ripple through today's celebrations. If you know where to look, take those towering floats at Rio's Carnival, draped in glitter but sharp with satire, skewering corrupt politicians with papier-mâché caricatures. Or the effigies burned at Spain's Fallas Festival, their flames consuming exaggerated likenesses of bankers and bureaucrats. These aren't just modern inventions. They're the direct descendants of the medieval fool's cap and the charivari's noisy mockery, proving that festivals have always been society's pressure valve. Even Halloween, with its subversive roots in Samhain, lets us don masks and mock power structures just as villagers once hid behind grotesque visors to lampoon their lords. The tools of dissent have evolved, but the blueprint remains startlingly familiar. Protest signs at Pride parades echo the embroidered banners medieval weavers stitched with hidden grievances. The Guy Fawkes masks worn by modern activists, a digital age twist on the anonymity of Venetian carnival disguises. Even flash mobs, those spontaneous bursts of dance or theater in public squares, channel the medieval tradition of rough music, where crowds used cacophony to shame wrongdoers. The methods may swap loots for smartphones and bonfires for hashtags, but the goal is unchanged: to speak truth to power without getting caught. Some connections are even more literal. In England's Padstow Abbey Festival, dancers still weave through streets wearing a sinister-looking hobby horse, a direct link to medieval fertility rites disguised as folk tradition. Germany's Puchtenlauf, with its horned winter demons, continues to terrify and delight, just as it did when those masks scared off both evil spirits and tax collectors. And when protesters at the G20 summit dressed as clowns to mock world leaders, they unknowingly revived the medieval fool's most potent weapon, ridicule that slips through the cracks of authority. What's truly remarkable is how these ancient tactics still work. Governments today still struggle to police festival-based dissent. Try arresting a mime in full makeup or banning a float for looking suspicious. Like their medieval counterparts, modern activists exploit the gray area between art and accusation. Banksy's shredded artwork at an auction house, that's the same spirit as the baker who accidentally burned the Lord's crest into a festival loaf. The anonymous collective projecting protest messages onto landmarks, they're the digital heirs of nighttime mummers scrawling slogans under cover of revelry. This enduring legacy reveals something profound about human nature. We still crave those liminal spaces where rules dissolve and hierarchies invert, where a drag queen's sashay down a street can upend gender norms as powerfully as a medieval cross-dressing mummer. The maypole's ribbons may now be rainbow-colored, but their spiral still twists toward justice, because whether it's 1520 or 2024, people will always find ways to dance their dissent, to laugh in the face of oppression, and to keep the fires of rebellion burning, one festival at a time. The romantic image of medieval festivals as hotbeds of rebellion isn't entirely wrong, but it's not the whole story either. For every defiant maypole dance mocking the nobility, there were just as many rituals designed to keep people in their place. Take the lavish tournaments hosted by kings, where armored knights reenacted battles for cheering crowds. These spectacles weren't just entertainment, they were carefully staged propaganda, reinforcing the idea that might made right and the social order was divinely ordained. Peasants might grumble about taxes, but watching their lord's son unhorse a rival in the lists reminded them where power truly lay. Even seemingly egalitarian traditions often had a conservative undercurrent. The Lord of Misrule, who ruled over winter feasts, a commoner temporarily elevated to mock royalty, usually had his reign strictly limited to a single day. The moment the festival ended, the real hierarchy snapped back into place, often with renewed vigor. In some German towns, the chosen Fool King was actually a wealthy merchant in disguise, his antics secretly reinforcing the idea that only those with means could handle power, even in jest. The church's role in these events was equally double-edged. While some priests turned a blind eye to pagan survivals in folk dances, others used festivals as tools of control. In Spain, Corpus Christi processions became moving lessons in orthodoxy, with elaborate floats depicting Helmuth swallowing sinners, a not-so-subtle warning against stepping out of line. French villagers might enjoy a raucous mystery play about Noah's Ark one day, only to hear a sermon the next condemning the very same play's lewd humor as proof of their inherent sinfulness. Popular culture loves to paint these gatherings as unified acts of resistance, but the reality was far messier. The same mummers' play that mocked a greedy abbot might also include jabs at lazy peasants or shrewish wives, reinforcing stereotypes as much as challenging them. Harvest feasts celebrated communal bonds, yes, but they also ritually honored the Lord, who allowed his tenants to keep a portion of what they'd grown on his land. Even the infamous Peasants' Revolt of 1381, often mythologized as a festival turned rebellion, was actually led by disillusioned minor gentry and craftsmen, not the dirt-poor serfs of legend. The most persistent myth that all folk traditions were ancient and unchanging. In truth, many rebellious rituals were comparatively recent inventions. The green-clad Jack in the Green figure of English May Day only appeared in the 18th century, long after the medieval period. Even the beloved Robin Hood ballads evolved over centuries, their earliest versions featuring far less wealth redistribution and far more bawdy humor about outwitting sheriffs. The real magic of these festivals wasn't that they always defied authority. It was that they could be anything the community needed them to be: safety valve, reinforcement tool, or revolutionary spark, sometimes all at once. What survives today isn't a neat divide between oppression and resistance, but a tangled web of both. The bonfire that warmed a villager's hands might also light the torch that burned his neighbor's house, depending on who held the flame. And that ambiguity, more than any simplistic tale of rebellion, is what makes these traditions so human. They weren't just battles between power and the people. They were the messy, contradictory sound of an entire society figuring itself out. One drunken song, one masked procession, one carefully coded insult at a time. Buried beneath layers of soil and centuries of silence, a trove of leather masks was recently uncovered near a medieval German village, their grotesque grins still intact, their hollow eye sockets staring blindly upward. These weren't mere costumes, they were time capsules of defiance. Archaeologists tracing the site of a long-forgotten carnival ground found the masks hidden in a pit beneath what was once a baker's oven. carefully wrapped in rotting linen as if waiting to be reclaimed. The most telling detail, several bore faint carvings on the inside names, dates, even crude maps of surrounding manors. These weren't just disguises for revelry, they were tools of organized resistance, worn by peasants who used festival chaos to coordinate everything from grain hoard raids to the sabotage of tax records. Modern technology is peeling back layers of secrecy that would have astonished even the original rebels. Multispectral imaging on a seemingly blank parchment from a French monastery revealed invisible ink recipes for festival face paint, mixtures incorporating egg whites and crushed beetles that would wash away by dawn, leaving no evidence. In Italy, ground-penetrating radar exposed a network of tunnels beneath a Renaissance fairground, their walls etched with symbols matching those found on outlawed tarot cards. Perhaps most chilling are the acoustic studies reconstructing lost festival soundscapes analysis showing how specific drum rhythms could carry coded messages over the noise of crowds, coordinating movements while guards heard only harmless dancing. Some discoveries rewrite history entirely. A cache of wooden dice excavated from an English tavern courtyard, originally dismissed as gaming pieces, turned out to be inscribed with tiny rebel slogans when examined under magnification. Loaded with lead weights, they'd land on subversive messages like "tear down the fences" or "bread before gold" more often than chance allowed. Even children's toys joined the resistance. Archaeologists in Poland unearthed a child's carved top that, when spun at certain speeds, revealed a hidden portrait of a local rebel leader through the illusion of motion. The true breakthrough came when linguists applied AI pattern recognition to centuries of festival songs. What appeared to be nonsensical refrains in medieval German and French carnival tunes actually contained sophisticated acrostics, the first letters of each line spelling out directions to hidden meeting spots or lists of corrupt officials. One drinking song from Flanders, when decoded, turned out to be meticulous instructions for disabling a nobleman's grain mill under cover of night. Another, disguised as a love ballad, contained precise measurements for redistributing stolen wool among weavers. Perhaps no find illustrates this hidden war better than the Fool's Bible, discovered walled up in a Czech church, a manuscript disguised as a psalter but filled with heretical texts between the lines, its margins crowded with festival mask designs doubling as battle maps. Carbon dating places it squarely during the Hussite rebellions when such books were burned on site. Yet someone risked everything to preserve it, sealing it away with a single playing card, the jester, tucked between the pages like a final laugh against authority. These artifacts don't just tell us about rebellion, they prove how deeply festivals were woven into the fabric of resistance, their bright ribbons tied around the fist of dissent. The masks may have crumbled and the bonfires turned to ash, but the spirit of those medieval festivals lingers in every protest chant, every satirical meme, every moment when ordinary people find clever ways to speak truth to power. What makes these centuries-old traditions so vital isn't just their historical intrigue, it's how they mirror our own struggles. The same ingenuity that carved hidden symbols into festival banners now fuels digital activism, where emojis become coded critiques and viral dances carry political subtext. Those peasants dancing around a maypole weren't just preserving pagan rites, they were proving that even the most rigid systems have cracks where light and resistance can slip through. Consider how modern movements borrow from this ancient playbook. When protesters dress as clowns to mock world leaders, they're channeling the medieval fool's razor-sharp disguise of humor. The Guy Fawkes masks worn at Occupy rallies, a direct descendant of Venetian Carnival Anonymity. Even flash mobs, those spontaneous bursts of song in public squares, echo the rough music of village processions that used noise to shame corrupt officials. The tools have changed, but the human impulse remains to challenge authority without getting caught, to turn celebration into confrontation. There's a deeper lesson here about the psychology of dissent. Medieval festivals worked because they exploited a paradox: the powerful could ban rebellion, but not laughter. A lord might execute a rebel, but punishing a jester made him look weak. Today's activists wield similar double-edged tactics. Banksy's shredded artwork at auction wasn't just vandalism, it was a carnivalesque prank that exposed the absurdity of art commodification. The Hong Kong protesters' Lennon walls, where sticky notes became protest art, functioned like festival ribbons, seemingly fragile, collectively unignorable. These historical echoes matter because they reveal an uncomfortable truth. Oppression rarely crumbles through sheer force. It unravels when people refuse to play by its rules, when they dance instead of march, mock instead of plead, turn the very systems meant to control them into stages for subversion. The medieval church never fully eradicated pagan traditions because banning joy is impossible. Modern authoritarian regimes struggle similarly with memes and music. Laughter, it turns out, is as essential to survival as bread. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the festivals we still celebrate. The bonfires of Midsummer Eve, the masked revelry of New Orleans Mardi Gras, even the pumpkin lanterns of Halloween, all carry faint whispers of their rebellious past. They remind us that celebration isn't just an escape from hardship, but a rehearsal for change. When we gather in shared joy, we're not just honoring tradition, we're flexing the same muscles our ancestors used to bend the arc of history. Because in the end, the greatest threat to any unjust system isn't anger, it's the audacity to imagine something better and the collective courage to make that vision irresistible. Medieval festivals were never just about the music, the food, or the dancing. They were the clash of worlds, where the powerless carved out spaces to resist, remember, and reimagine their lives. Beneath the colorful banners and raucous laughter, these gatherings became the stage for something far more profound, a quiet revolution disguised as revelry. Think about the sheer audacity of it. Peasants who spent their days bowing to lords could, for one fleeting night, crown a fool king, mock tax collectors in song, or dance in patterns that traced forbidden symbols into the earth. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were declarations that the world didn't have to stay as it was. Consider the legacy of these rebellions. When German villagers hid protest songs in carnival tunes or English weavers smuggled messages in festival ribbons, they were doing more than resisting. They were proving that culture could be a weapon. The same bonfires the church claimed for saints once honored older gods, their flames a stubborn refusal to let history be rewritten. Even the masks so central to these celebrations weren't just about anonymity, they were about transformation. Behind a carved wooden face, a serf could speak like a king, a woman could preach like a priest, and for a moment, the rigid lines of medieval life blurred beyond recognition. Today, we might not dance around maypoles or burn effigies of tax collectors, but the spirit of those festivals lives on. Every protest that uses humor to disarm authority, every viral meme that twists a politician's words, even the way we reclaim public spaces for joy, these are the descendants of medieval resistance. The next time you see a crowd in costumes at a parade or hear a satirical song go viral, remember, subversion has always thrived where power least expects it. So what does this mean for us? Perhaps it's a reminder that celebration and resistance have always been intertwined, that laughter can be revolutionary and shared joy a form of defiance. The next time you light a sparkler, wear a mask, or raise a toast, think about the hidden histories simmering beneath the surface. Because the truth is, every festival, then and now, is a chance to ask who gets to write the rules and what happens when we decide to rewrite them together. Now it's your turn. Have you spotted hidden meanings in modern celebrations? Seen a tradition that feels like it's carrying an older, deeper story? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep unraveling history's best-kept secrets. And if you love this dive into the darker side of medieval revelry, don't forget to subscribe. There are always more stories waiting just beneath the surface, and we're just getting started.